Today is November 11th, 2010. My name is Marla Picklesheimer, and I'm talking with Curtis Hughes at my home at 930 Niblet Drive in Castleberry, Florida. Curtis is a lifelong resident of Seminole County and has lived in several different communities here. He also taught and was an administrator for many years in the county. Curtis, would you please share some of your favorite memories of Seminole County with us today?
Okay. This is going to be rambling, disjointed.
That's fine.
As I think of things, I'll tell you about them. I'm 73. I was actually born in a hospital in Sanford, when the hospital was on 6th Street and Oak Avenue, behind what was in the library, or next to the library. The things I'm going to talk about are things that I remember, but I'm not sure they're completely accurate because your memory sometimes fools you. So please, this is just memory, my memory, and some things that my parents and friends have told me. I was born, my family was living in what is now the Lyman High School. It used to be a parking lot. I'm not sure they had a new building, but somewhere where Lyman is now, in a grapefruit grove. There's one small house in the grapefruit grove, and no neighbors except across what was then 1792. It's now, I think, 427, runs from Ronald Reagan Boulevard. The highway then was the only highway that went from Sanford to Orlando. The present 1792 did not exist. Everything was dirt roads. There was a hard road from the corner of the then 1792, 427, that went straight west and ended at Altamonte Springs, which was a favorite spot in those days. I can remember many times sliding down that big slide and swimming there, having picnics. It's a great place. Also, Shepherd Springs, which was directly north of that, was a very popular place at that time. It had been, up until the time that my family started going there, probably in the 40s, it had been a Coca-Cola bottling plant, I understand. So, and they had gotten the water from Shepherd Springs, which is one of the springs just past Altamonte Springs on the Little Wekiva River. I am rambling. I told you I'd do that.
That's fine.
I can not remember this, but my parents have told me that when I was about 3 years old that I went adventuring, maybe 4 years old, and a neighbor brought me back and said to my mother, "Do you want this kid?" And my mother said yes. She said, "Well, I found him walking north on 1792, and I thought maybe that isn't what you wanted to have happen." So that was my first adventure that I can remember people telling me about anyway. Also, I can vaguely remember in, probably I was 5 years old, maybe I can't remember that, but I've heard about it several times. During World War II, there was a drive for rubber. World War II wanted all the rubber it could get. So I heard about this, and I was playing one day with an aunt of mine who was about, well, still is, about 5 years older than I am, which would make her about 10 at the time. And we decided that we would donate all the rubber we could find. Now, before the war had started, my parents had bought me a tricycle and a wagon and some other toys, all with pure rubber on them. And we spent half a day, I understand, half a day, tearing that rubber off the wheels to donate to the cause. Needless to say, my dad was not very happy about that.
Always a patriot.
Always a patriot. When I was 5, approximately, at that time, my dad was working for Herman Jean Service Station on the corner of 427 and 434 at present. The old 1792 and 434 didn't even exist. I guess it would be the Sanford Road. And he was working 6 days a week, and every other week he'd work the 7th day and was making $10 a week. And we were doing pretty well on that. Then we decided to move to Sanford. That would have been about 1942. and we lived in Sanford until I was out of college. We'd stayed for a while with my grandparents, who were on a celery farm out on, well, you could see Lake Monroe from their farm, out from Sanford to the west. Let me think now, what else do I want to tell you?
Do you know what's there, where that celery farm is now?
It's still a farm there. Sulfur water, I can remember drinking sulfur water. That was all we had. And you didn't even think about it in those days. Now I would not be able to stand drinking sulfur water. But who knows, I guess. When my mother and father were dating back in 1935 and 36, my dad, who had been born in Winter Park on New York Avenue, and my mother, who had been born on Lake Markham, out the Longwood-Markham Road from Longwood, right on out to what's 46 now. Okay. Anyway, they were dating, and my father would drive 3, 4, 5 times a week down what is now Markham Woods Road. And during the time they were dating, way back in the 30s, the road was paved. And I understand it became dirt one other time. And then, of course, when they put I-4 in, I-4 used it as a supply road to build I-4.
Talking about Markham Woods Road?
The Markham Woods Road. They completely tore it up, and it was repaved again probably 2 years after I-4 was completed. My mother was originally from Indiana, and my dad, of course, Winter Park. My granddad was born in Altamonte. My great-granddad was born in Brooksville. My great-grandfather, until about 1942 or 43, owned one of the 2 general stores in Altamonte. And they were both fairly close to the corner by the railroad tracks of where 427 and 436 intersect. There was another general store on the, what would that be, the northeast corner, and my great-grandfather's general store was on the northwest corner.
Was 436 there, or was that
436 was not there, but there was a road that came down from the train station, which was right there also, where the tracks go across now. And from the train station to a big hotel, which was on Maitland Avenue and 436, where they are now. There was no Maitland Avenue, but there was a road where 436 was, down as far as the hotel. And the people would come in to vacation at the hotel in Altamonte. And they would pick them up at the train station by my grandfather's general store at the depot.
I think they had a special little trolley that took them down to the
Probably.
to the.
I don't remember it. I'm just telling you now
Yeah.
what. I do remember going to my great-grandfather's general store, and they had a gas pump out front, one of the old ones with the tank at the top, big lever that you would pump a gallon of gas into the tank at the top, glass tank, and then you drained it out into someone's gas tank. And I guess it wasn't exactly safe, but I can remember by the hour just pumping that thing full and draining it back into the tank. Pumping it full and draining it back into the tank.
Just playing with it.
I think my great-grandfather was babysitting and didn't want to have to mess with me. So he kept me busy. After we moved to Sanford, can you turn it off for a moment? Thank you. I needed to make a few notes of some things I remembered and didn't remember, so on. And I'll just talk about a few of these. My work life, when I was about 9 years old, my uncle owned a store about a half a block from my house, and I went to work for him. I worked for at least 15 or 20 minutes every Saturday for a quarter. I swept out the store, he inspected it, and I got my quarter. Of course, I had to redo it several times. on several occasions. From there, I worked for $1 a week, sweeping it out almost every day, and from there I worked for $2.50 a week to work every afternoon after school. And meanwhile, my uncle had sold the store, and the man that bought it kept me on. And then I can remember going to the Ritz Theater as an usher, making 35 cents an hour.
This is all in Sanford.
This is all in Sanford. This is all on 3rd Street where we were living then, 3rd and Holly. Excuse me, someone's at your door, so. Some of the things I can remember was the pool in Sanford. I learned to swim in the pool. There were very few people there at that time. Huge pool right down on the lakefront next to the Mayfair Hotel. I think they tore that down probably while I was in the military or while I was away at college. Another thing was the Sanford Zoo. I loved the Sanford Zoo. It was right at the corner of 1st Street, of Lakefront and Park Avenue. And I can remember Peggy the bear. You would give her a peanut and she would dance for you. And then you'd have to go scrounge around looking for another one because we couldn't afford to buy peanuts. And then feed it to Peggy and she'd dance for you some more. It was great. And the lion roars at night. You could hear them at my house. The lion roars were quite impressive. I've seen the Sanford Zoo completely underwater. I've seen the lake high enough several times, at least 3 times, that the water would come right up onto the bulkhead, over the bulkhead, and extend back as much as 1.5 blocks toward Sanford, toward the middle of Sanford, from the lakefront. And you could wade in water up to your knees trying to get to the bulkhead down at the lakefront.
Was that Donna when that came through?
Donna was one of them. There were several of them. I wasn't here at Donna. I was down in Tampa in a barracks made out of one of these big ones made out of metal, listening to the hurricane pass over the top.
Wow.
Trying to get
Hoping it wouldn't roll you away, right?
Trying to get rank for the Air Force. It didn't work. I came back and joined as a airman first. I went to Seminole High School when it was where the Sanford Middle School is now. Big, old, rambling building right on French Avenue. And French Avenue at that time had a steep hill coming up to it from 13th Street and big oaks on either side of the road. It was beautiful. They're all gone now. When they widened French Avenue, put 1792 through, the oaks had to go.
So that's the site of Sanford Middle, you said now?
That's Sanford Middle now.
Yeah.
Yeah, the celery feds. And they were called the celery feds because Sanford, of course, as most people already know, was nothing but celery farms. We were famous for our celery for one reason is that we bleached our celery, which made it sweet. By bleaching our celery, we could sell it for higher prices than anyone else around unless they also bleached. And bleaching consisted of putting a piece of paper about that high and a whole roll of it, and they'd unroll it around the celery stalks with just the top of the celery sticking out. And when it was bleached for several weeks, not getting any sun, it turned almost completely white. And,
They changed the taste and everything, huh?
Excellent, changed all the taste. But gradually, buildings, people, and the farms have mostly all disappeared. I lived on 3rd and Holly, as I mentioned a moment ago, and at that time that was a railroad community. All of my neighbors were either conductors or firemen or engineers or else worked down at the, we had a big roundhouse, a place where they turned the engines around. They'd drive the engine on and a big wheel would turn and the engine would pull off facing in another direction. I understand there are no more roundhouses. They just put 2 engines back to back now. But it was a great place to explore if it didn't run your way.
Do you remember which railroad that was?
Atlantic Coastline.
Okay.
Atlantic Coastline.
The one that's there today.
Yeah.
That comes down through Longwood.
There's still, the depot is now abandoned. It looks horrible, but the auto train still comes into part of it, not the whole thing. Most of it was down where now is, well, for a while it was Scotty's, and it's Pebble Junction, a place that sells rocks. You've probably driven past it on French Avenue. Hunting, oh yes, hunting. When I was a kid, I used to hunt quail and ducks. And I did very little deer hunting, but in fact I've never shot an animal any bigger than a duck. But I used to hunt. And a friend of mine, when I was about 14 years old, and he was 15, had a brand new scooter. I don't even remember what it was. But I would sit on the back of that holding our shotguns, and he would drive, and we would go right down the main street of Sanford and out to the Cameron property out by Cameron Avenue and walk out on the shores of Lake Jessup and do our hunting. And then if we got any ducks, we'd come back with the ducks in one hand, the shotguns in the other, right back through the middle of Sanford from Mellonville, right back down to 3rd where I lived. And no one seemed to mind. In those days, 2 kids with shotguns, but nowadays it would be a different story.
Get arrested.
Yeah, put under the jail. I can also remember hunting out on, where was it? On the way out to Lake Harney. A friend of mine and I were on Osceola Road, I think they call it. And we found, we ran down an armadillo, and my friend held it and hid behind a pine tree, and I took pictures of it and won honorable mention in a Kodak contest, a nationwide Kodak contest. I'd had Mr. Wiebolt, who was a man that ran the camera shop at that time in downtown Sanford, make me a picture, probably about this big, and I shipped it away, and they liked it.
The armadillo was alive.
The armadillo was alive. He was just struggling
And mad.
Mad, very mad. And we turned it loose, and it went wherever armadillos go. Yes, I also remember when I worked at the Ritz Theater, I would work till midnight, quite a few nights. And as I would walk back through Sanford, now this is 16, so this was maybe in the early 50s, very early 50s. I'd walk back through Sanford to go home at midnight. And no one thought anything of a 16-year-old boy wandering down the street every night about midnight. But I do remember a policeman with a police dog. And I would look up every now and then as I was on my way home, and I'd walk down the middle of the street, or I'd walk the sidewalk, or whatever it might be, and he'd be standing over by a building somewhere, watching me go past. And I talked to my dad about him a couple of times. He said, "Oh yeah," he says, "I know, he tells me. He tells me. He knows what you're doing. He knows where you're coming from." And of course that was Sanford in the early 50s. Was there anything else? Oh, there's a lot more I could probably tell you, but I can't think of much right now. If you want to go ahead and turn it off.
How about, before we turn it off, how about when you started teaching at South Seminole?
Oh, South Seminole Middle School, yes. I got out of the military in 1964, and I took my wife down to South Seminole to get a job, and she interviewed with Mr. John Angel, and got the job teaching English in the 8th grade. And as I was sitting out in the front office, I guess it would be, he walked out with her, and he said, "Oh, Curtis," he said, "what are you doing now?" I said, "Mr. Angel, I just got out of the military. I have no idea." He says, "I understand you have a degree." I said, "Yeah, who told you that?" He said, "Oh, it's a grapevine." And incidentally, he had taught me in high school. And he said, "You want to teach?" I said, "I'll let you know. How long do I have?" He said, "Until Monday," and this was Friday. So I called him Monday morning, and on Tuesday I went into the school and started teaching. Never dreamed I was going to be a teacher. And that leads me to this. In those days, Winter Park Drive was not paved from Seminole down to the school. It was a dirt road. And we were coming in from Sanford, my wife and I together, and we'd come down that little dirt road to get to the school. And out in the middle of that little dirt road, almost every morning, was a collie dog. And he'd stand up and shake himself, and the sand would just fly off of him. We started calling him Sandy. And every morning, we'd have to stop, blow the horn, Sandy would get out of the way, and we'd drive on to the school. Does it look like that now?
Both of you were teaching at South Seminole?
Both of us taught at South Seminole for 2 years. And then my wife moved on to the high school, and I taught for 5 years, went into administration, was a dean of students, assistant principal, and then finally transferred to Millwee as assistant principal. And then got the job of principal at Tuscaloosa Middle School, and stayed there 9 years as principal, and then went back to South Seminole 7 years as principal. And that was pretty well my life.
You retired from South Seminole?
I retired in 1992 from South Seminole. It's a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
A long time ago. More notes. When I lived on 3rd and Holly, it was a railroad community right around us. Everybody worked for the railroad. We were only about 3 or 4 blocks from where they had the railroad yards, the main yards coming into Sanford, which was one of the main terminals anywhere along the Atlantic coastline. I can remember there was a roundhouse over there, and the roundhouse was where they brought the engine in, and then they revolved it on a big disc where it would point in the other direction, and then they would pull out of the roundhouse. It was fascinating, but I got chased out of there a couple of times and probably never saw as much as I wanted of that. Yeah, my next door neighbor was a conductor. My uncle was an engineer. Oh, he used to take that train. He engineered the train that went from Sanford through near where I'm living now, down the Markham Road, across the Wekiva, onto DeVaries, Eustis, and so on. And he called it the log train to Trilby. I don't know if that was a real name of it or not, but he dreaded it because he said there was so much switching and picking up logs and things, and then going on and picking something else up, and it was very boring to him. But he went right by where, oh yes, there used to be a depot, a small depot, and a gathering place for turpentine. Did I mention this before? A small gathering place for turpentine, because where I'm living now, out on the Markham Lake area, was turpentine, big turpentine, and they picked it up there at that terminal. In fact, across the road, in what is now part of the Wekiva Forest, Wekiva Preserve, is along the Wekiva, used to be a big hotel. In fact, parts of it are still there. And the ground out there had been laid out in roads and crossroads and lots. And when I was fairly young, I could still see the roads and things that went through there. And I've wandered around there, well, within the last year or so, quite a bit. And most traces of that are gone, but you can still find pieces of the old hotel, pieces of wood and such out there. And you find a lot of pots, pieces of pots especially, where they gathered the turpentine, which is a fairly interesting thing. But yeah, I'll never forget my uncle. He really didn't like that log train to Trilby. Artesian wells in that area, yes, artesian wells. There used to be a watermelon patch across on the west side of the Longwood Markham Road, which is just a short stretch of road between Markham Road and Highway 46, parallels the Wekiva River, maybe a couple hundred yards from the Wekiva. And between the Wekiva River and the Longwood Markham Road, there used to be at least 4 or 5 artesian wells, just out of the ground, nothing pumps, just out. And they had watermelon patches over there. And they had plenty of irrigation for them. And of course, as a young person, I helped them with their watermelon patches a few times.
Those wells been capped now?
They have been capped. They've dried up.
Really?
Artesian wells seem to have dried up in Seminole County. The water table must have dropped. Oh, they would come out of the ground sometimes 3-4 feet high.
Yeah.
There was that much force underneath them. And I haven't seen anything like that in years. In fact, the last one I knew of was by the big tree on 1792. And I think it's either been capped or it's dry now. And the ones that haven't dried up have been capped. So there's very few left. And especially the one by the big tree was very, very strong sulfur smell. Had a lot of sulfur. In fact, when you would bottle it, the sulfur would come out in sort of hunks. You could see it.
Really?
Yeah, you could see it looked like some kind of growth, some kind of black growth. But we'd strain it and drink it.
Did it taste like sulfur?
Tasted like sulfur water. And I can't drink sulfur water now, but I did in those days.
First, you mentioned Shepherd Springs. Can you tell us about that?
There are a lot of springs. Some of them have dried up, but there are a lot of springs that people don't really know much about in this area. Santaland Springs has, of course, Shepherd Springs I've told you about just to the north of there. Not very far north of there, well, maybe a couple hundred yards. And there's Miami Springs, which is fairly close to the Wekiva Springs. And, there must be at least 3 or 4 springs right in this, or used to be right in this area that I'm talking about now, the one around between Santaland and Wekiva Springs. You can see there's little creeks now going down into the Wekiva River, and most of those start from small springs. In fact, I've heard that there's something like, I don't know, probably 100 springs that flow into the Wekiva River, or come up into the bottom of the Wekiva River between the St. Johns River and Wekiva Springs. The water table going down, though, is taking care of a lot of those. They haven't capped any springs yet, although, yes, they have capped some springs. One of the springs over just across the river in Gemini, Gemini Park, has been capped. There were 3 big springs in there. They left 2 of them and capped 1 of them. I have no idea why, but it has been capped.
Are some of those on private land that you mentioned?
A lot of them are on private land, yes. There's a big spring down in just west of the Wekiva River, Seminole Springs. And Seminole Springs is still open, I think, but it's not flowing nearly as much as it was. But it supplies most of the water that goes into the Blackwater, which joins the Wekiva, which goes into the St. John's. So most of it for the Blackwater Seminole Springs run together. Flow quite a bit of water into the Wekiva. If anyone fishes that area, they've probably seen it. You call it the Big Whirl, where Blackwater comes into the Wekiva. And it is a big whirl. It's a good place to turn your boat around if you get down the Wekiva in a big boat and have to get back out. Some of the other things I have is, I mentioned hunting one time before. I used to hunt the lakefront, where the hospital is now, and south to where the zoo is now. Speaking of Lake Monroe, my granddad and I would go down there, and he, being a poor southerner, ate squirrel because they were free, and he would go out hunting squirrel, or he'd go out hunting rabbits, or whatever he could get, and they would go in the pot. And we hunted that whole area in there. In fact, I can remember running up to the house and telling my grandmother, Grandmom, there's a squirrel in the tree out here. And she'd grab the shotgun and come running out, and we'd have squirrel for dinner. No, that really actually happened. I don't think we'd do it now, but we have a little bit more money now than we used to.
Is that the same grandfather that...
This is the grandfather that came out of Indiana.
Okay.
This is a grandfather that when we'd have a thunderstorm, or when he'd see some lightning, he would go to bed, pull the cover over his head. He'd come out of the fields, go to bed until the lightning storm was over, because when he was a kid, he'd been in Nebraska. I guess he must have been doing something with wheat with an 8-mule team, and lightning had hit the traces, the that went metal and wood to all the mules and killed all the mules and knocked him unconscious. And my grandfather was quite a fun person, but not when there was a thunderstorm around. Oh yes, in 1944-45, my grandfather was living on the northeast side of Lake Markham, which, if you don't know Lake Markham, is out by Sylvan Lake, out toward the Wekiva River. And he raised cotton. He had probably 7, 8, 10 acres of cotton. And he raised the best cotton crop you've ever seen out there on that sand hill. I don't know how he did it. Of course, there was water there then, plenty of water. And he managed to harvest it, managed to get it in his barn, managed to get it up in the hayloft, filled it full of cotton. He had a big log barn out there on the shore of Lake Markham, and couldn't sell it. There was no place that they could market it to. If he'd lived in Georgia, he'd have had a way to get rid of it, but he had no way. And when I was a kid, I can remember picking seeds out. And I'll tell you, it's no fun to pick seeds out of cotton. It's hard work.
What did he finally do with all that he'd harvested?
As far as I can remember, it must have just sat there and rotted. I'm sure he took it out of the loft and put it out in the field somewhere, but he never sold a bit of it.
Oh, what a shame.
Of course, that's the kind of farmer my grandfather was.
Did you say he built a log cabin when he first came?
Yeah, he built a log cabin on the north side of well, where I'm talking about, the same area I'm talking about. He built a log cabin, he built a large log barn, and you could go inside, and the logs on the inside were the same logs that you look at on the outside, with caulking, of course. And he hadn't painted it or anything. It was still the same, whatever color the outside was, that's what color the inside was. It was a large house. It was nice. My grandmother and grandfather, these are my mother's family, loved to have people come by. They didn't have any money, but they always had food. And I can also remember in 1940s, early 40s, one of my aunts married a sailor stationed at Sanford Naval Base. And he kept bringing all of his buddies out to my grandmother's to visit and to eat. And they would eat her out of house and home, but she enjoyed every moment of it. She had an old Victrola. What do you call it?
Victrola?
Victrola, yes, that you have to wind up, and it had just a piece of metal for the record, and played things like the Black Mustache and songs like the Tennessee Waltz. And she also had 4 other daughters, 3 other daughters that weren't married, and of course they did some attracting too, but nothing serious came out of any of that. But they would come out and visit her, and just have a good time. Not a bad time, but a good time. A good time for everybody.
Did they ever build a frame house, or is that log house still there, or what happened to it?
They moved out of it probably in the middle 40s and moved into Sanford, where they could get some better land for farming, and sold that property. I have no idea how much or what they sold it for. And they lived over not far from where the hospital is, on 10 or 12 acres of land. And then from there they moved back to Monroe Corner, where they had 12, 14, 16 acres of land. And from there they moved into where the hospital is now, where they just had 5 acres of land, and he worked otherwise and farmed on the side. Couldn't get the farming out of his blood. It was there. And I loved the farm.
Did he sell it each time he would move?
He would sell it and buy another place, yes. I can remember he used to raise strawberries. Oh man, I loved it when he raised strawberries. I don't know how he ever found any to sell. Oh, when I was a kid, my brother was about 4 or 5, and I was probably 10. I had a bicycle with a great big basket on the front. And I would go out to my granddad's farm, and he would give me as much cauliflower or whatever he was raising, cauliflower, cabbage, radishes, turnips, you name it, as I wanted. And I'd wash them there in the artesian well. I'd put it in the basket, and we'd go from house to house selling it. And we'd give we had a deal with my granddad. He got half, and we divided the other half.
Oh, pretty good deal.
And it worked out very well. My neighbors got fresh vegetables, good vegetables,
Huh?
and we earned a little bit of money. And it's things that he might have been able to sell, but probably not anyway. Yeah, my childhood was a great time. I wandered all over town, did whatever I wanted. My parents didn't worry about me. I'd disappear on Sunday after church, but they wouldn't see me again until after dark. But it was a good time.
Do you know about how big Sanford was then?
I don't know the size of it, but I know that it consisted mainly of just Sanford Avenue and First Street, where they come together downtown Sanford. And probably it didn't even extend to French Avenue at that time. Nothing but houses anyway. No stores. It was a small town. There was some things over on Magnolia, down at 2nd Street and 3rd Street, and a few things on Palmetto down as far as 2nd Street from 1st Street. But you get any more out of town, and it was just homes. But yeah, it was good. Rand Yard. I remember Rand Yard. Rand Yard was where the big ice plant was, down between the river and back to the west, maybe 3/4 of a mile or a mile from where the hospital in Sanford is now. And they had a huge ice house that probably was maybe 3 or 4 stories high. Anyway, at Rand House, this thing was about 3 or 4 stories high, and their water dripped off the side of it all the time. So hot weather, you get down there and lean up against the building, and the water would get you nice and cool, wet you down completely, and you get little bits of ice every now and then. They used it to ice down the train cars, the things where they had vegetables and stuff in the train cars. No refrigeration then, so they put ice in there with the vegetables or whatever it might be. And it was a lot of fun, but again, I didn't visit very many times because I kept getting chased off.
Did they sell ice to people?
I don't think they sold ice actually there, but we had 2 ice houses in Sanford. We had Hunter's Ice, which was on 13th Street, just off of French, and then we had another one down on 6th Street in French. And we also stole ice well, back when I was a kid, the iceman would deliver into Longwood, and as a 5-year-old, I can remember the guy with the leather on his shoulder, and he'd put that piece of ice on his shoulder and take it in the house, put it in the house, put it in the ice box, and when he'd come out, he'd hand me a little piece of ice. Well, my parents have helped me remember this, but anyway, he'd hand me a little piece of ice, and I would enjoy that. So, yeah. They also gave away free ice picks. I haven't seen one of those in years.
Do you know where the ice came from? Did they
made it.
made it here?
Yeah, I would imagine, and I don't know this, but I would imagine they made it out at Rand Yard and moved it into the ice houses where they put them on trucks for the people of Hughes and Sanford, yeah. And of course in Longwood where I was. So, I don't think they didn't make the ice there. I'm pretty sure they must have made it out at Rand siding. You can still see those buildings if you drive down over the big hump that goes over the railroad tracks out from Sanford to the west, and drive about down to a place called Dench's Beer, the distributor for beer. You turn there to the right and go toward the lakefront, and you can see all the big buildings still down there.
All the tracks?
Well, you
tracks
can see
still
all
there?
the tracks, and you can still see part of the ice house and such.
Yeah?
I can't remember how much is there now, but there was still part of it the last time I looked.
Abandoned.
Yeah, abandoned for years. Yeah. But it was quite a concern at one time. In fact, where Crooms Academy is right now, they had a lot of packing houses. They had a lot of places that you could pack your vegetables in these little flimsy little crates that they ship things in then. And they even had a place out on, behind Crooms, probably 1/4 of a mile, back to where Airport Boulevard. They even made those little boxes, the flimsy little boxes that would wire down over vegetables. There was a lot of employment then. Maybe it'd be nice to have employment like that now.
Yeah.
another thing I wanted to talk about, parades in Sanford. When I was a kid, there were parades. It seemed like every time you turn around, there'd be another parade. And the kids would just line the streets on both sides. And there would always floats and things from the high school and floats and things from all the churches. And it was just a big thing in Sanford when I was a kid. But it seems like after I got back from college, I didn't see much of that anymore. And that was a long time ago. That was in the 50s.
So it's 4th of July, you're thinking maybe? The
Well, there
parade?
was always a 4th of July. There was always one when the homecoming for the football team at the celery feds. Now, what high school would call themselves celery feds nowadays?
I've never heard that. That's a new one.
That's it. Well, they were celery fed.
And the high school itself was called Celery
The
High.
high school itself, the celery feds were us.
Yeah. When did they change the name? Do you know?
I don't know. Sometime while I was gone somewhere. I shouldn't have left town, I guess. But yeah, parades were great. I even got in the parade several times. I mentioned the bicycle with the big basket. I would decorate it. And my brother would too. He did the same thing after I was gone to college. He'd decorate his bicycle and ride up and down with the parade just like he knew what he was doing. Yep. Let's see, what else do I have here? I guess that's all I have written down.
You talked about the Cameron property. Can you describe where that was?
Oh, the Cameron property that we hunted on. I never met Mr. Cameron, or I never met the whole group. There was a whole family of Camerons. And I never met the other rancher, whatever his name was, that had the other ranch on the shores of Lake Jessup. But they had thousands of acres around the end of Lake Jessup. And my friend was related some way to the Camerons, and he had permission to use the property, and we would go down there. It was great if the water wasn't high, but if the water was high, all the cattle would be forced up into the woods, and at that time you didn't want to go in the woods with all the cattle.
Shoot a cow.
Well, maybe you get run over by a cow or something. I used to also fish the river. We'd wade in the river up to about waist deep, from Lake Jessup back down towards Sanford, and fish for bass. I've caught quite a few bass that way too. But you'd walk along in that mud and silt and stuff, and you'd feel a branch with your feet, and you would swear something was going to get you. But that was some of the fun of it.
You weren't worried about gators?
No. There were gators in there, yes.
Yeah.
But we didn't worry about alligators. They never bothered us. Never even thought about them.
Didn't eat your fish off the end of your line.
No. I got lost a couple of times. One Sunday, after church, I decided I was going to walk over to my friend's house. He lived in the Mayfair section, which is to the east of Sanford, on just off Mellonville Avenue, Scott Avenue, and some other avenues in there. And I walked over to my friend's house, and he wasn't home, so I decided I'd walk behind his house to that fringe of swamp that goes on down to where, parallel to the canal that goes where the river used to be. The canal from Sanford, it goes down toward the boat works. The boat works at the end of Celery Avenue. And it's just a thin strip of swamp. But as there were a lot of farms down there then, and the farms backed up to the swamp area, which when you got a little bit deep into the swamp, you couldn't farm anymore. But they had dug drainage ditches out into the swamp, and they were piled up beside the ditch. And in my good clothes, my church clothes, I walked out one of the paths. I walked to the end of the path. I must have seen something over. I was probably 12 years old. And I saw something that looked interesting, so I went a little ways into the swamp. And again, it wasn't a quarter mile wide, just a thin strip of swamp. But when you get down toward the river, you get into mud, chest deep. And I walked a little bit more, and I couldn't see my way out. And I went in there probably about noon, And I finally found my way out about 4 or 5 o'clock. And I was covered with mud from the neck down, where I'd had to wade across things to get out. And the sun finally came out. It was a cloudy day, and I used the sun to get out like I should have done if I had had any sun to do it with. And I found a pocket. A pocket is a piece of pipe about that big around that has an artesian well that comes into it. And you fill this pocket up with water, and it drains down underneath the farm and irrigates the farm. And there are a lot of little pockets along there, so you can see that the water is running, and you can reach down and stop up certain lines across your field underneath the surface if you don't want to water that area. So you'd had little stoppers that were about 8 inches long and about that big, and you'd reach down into a pocket and close up the pipe, and or turn off the artesian well, which had a pipe on it and a big handle on it to turn it on and off. Either turn it off or leave it on and close pockets. And I cleaned up in one of those big pockets with an artesian well, and I got home, and my mom took one look at me, and she said, "The clothes, okay, but I don't think we're going to be able to replace those shoes right now." Enough of that story anyway.
Your mom wasn't real happy.
Uh,
What crops did they grow out there in that part of east of Sanford?
Oh, they were growing the same thing. They were growing celery until probably in the 40s, and then they changed to mostly cabbage, I guess. And Meriwether had a lot of farms out there. There are a bunch of farms out there.
Is that why the community of Midway was out there?
Well, yeah, Midway was not a regular type community. This was a community of blacks. And what would happen is it was full of seasonal workers that worked all the way up and down the East Coast. And the grandparents, grandparent usually just a grandmother, would stay with the children while the parents worked up and down the East Coast, all the way from maybe D.C. where they had cherry picking, or maybe whatever it happened to be. And a good part of the year there wouldn't be anyone there except the grandmothers and the children. So Midway was more or less, I don't know what you would call it, just a caretaking community when I was a kid.
Is Midway because midway between Sanford and
I have no
Titusville?
idea why they named it that, but because it's not midway between anything that I know of. Midway between Sanford and Lake Jessup, maybe? I don't know. I don't know. But later on, I sold for about a year. I sold insurance. And I sold insurance in there, and they were some of the nicest people in that area that I've ever worked with. They would buy a policy that only cost them $25 a week, maybe. But they were buying insurance, and they believed in insurance. And I finally figured I wasn't really giving them enough value for their money, and I got out of that. I went into the military. But what else can I tell you about? I'm pretty well talked out. I guess that's about it.
Oh, good.